For 9 out of 10 industry events, it's much better to go as visitors rather than exhibitors.
Welcome to Inside Stellar, a podcast where we bring you behind the scenes to experience how Stellar builds deals, solves challenges, and makes the strategic calls that shape a growing business and connectivity. Stellar brings perfect internet on the move by leveraging all cellular, Wi-Fi, and satellite networks into one unbreakable internet solution. Natalia, Dursun, and Simona here, and today we'll be talking about industry events.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
So why are we talking about industry events today?
Why do we go to events?
And why don't we exhibit at events, right? So I think the big question is going to industry events, either as exhibitor or as an attendee, is a great way to market and sell our products. A lot of businesses do that. And for us, based on our experience, we've realized that actually going as visitors is much more beneficial and cost effective as opposed to exhibiting. We still exhibit at events, but to a lesser extent.
Exactly.
Yeah, I would say one reason there are multiple reasons why a startup or a company or a young innovative enterprise or a large established corporation goes to events. They can go for branding, they can go for closing deals, they can go for just finding a spot where they can invite current customers or prospects and just shake hands all in the same place. So this is obvious. The real question is how we approach events, because on our side, the part of, let's just say, pure branding is a bit less relevant if that branding aspect is not finalized to closing deals. We are a fundamentally B2B enterprise company. So for us, being recognized by everyone on the road matters just up to a certain extent. And so what we need to do is really to be sure that we pick and choose the right places we were going with the team at Stellar. And I think Dursun brought up a great point. The important question is, we're going to events. Okay, great. Are we going as visitors or are we going as attendees? And how do we pick one or the other?
Yeah, so in 2025, overall, we have 44 events that we're attending, out of which only 4 we're exhibiting at. So when does it make sense to exhibit rather than only attending as visitors? I think we looked at it in different ways because our main focus is to sell, obviously, at the events that we go. And in order to make the decision to exhibit, we want to be sure that the event we're going to exhibit at is worth it for us. And that's where we can find our customer group. How do we decide which events it is?
So let me ask one question before we go down this rabbit hole, because it's going to be a very interesting rabbit hole, I think, is in your experience, we've all attended events of multiple types. In your experience, which events are the most interesting? What does it take for an event to be labeled as interesting for you two?
To actually take a step back, the events we identify as relevant might not necessarily be relevant or as much relevant as we think they would be. And I think for me, in particular, this year is also a lot of trial and error in a way. I'm attending a lot of events. I think this year alone, up until this point, I've attended like around 20 events on my own. And a lot of the times it's also figuring out if event is relevant or not, and then making decision, do we want to come back next year as visitors, or is it actually relevant enough for us to exhibit? So there is also that element as well. It's like a trial and error, figuring out if events is indeed relevant. But in terms of once then we are at the event as visitors, from my point of view, it depends how specific the event is. Also depends on the size of the event. What I've figured is the smaller the event, more focused the event, the deeper the conversations can be with the companies, with prospects, right, with potential clients. And I have much more possibility to really get to know them, their pain points, and really understand if Stellar is the right solution and figure out a better way to position us as the problem solvers. Whereas if the event is very big, I'll be very honest, I actually start feeling anxious and I start panicking. I'm like, oh my God, there's so many companies, right? It's very difficult, even just from that perspective, thinking that how am I supposed to find companies that are relevant? And also in the big events, usually these are like salespeople, marketing people at the booths who are very open to discuss and share, because of course they are there with their own goals, with their own agenda. And relevant people are rarely at the booths, whereas if the event is smaller, relevant people most often are at the booths and you can have a deeper conversation. It's a more of an intimate setting and people don't feel rushed to go on to the next person.
So when you talk about smaller events, you don't necessarily mean it for smaller companies. It's really like the amount of exhibitors that are at a certain event or as visitors that is at a certain event, right?
Indeed, yeah, the size of the event, like how many exhibitors are there? Are there like thousands of exhibitors or there are under 100 exhibitors?
Yeah, I would say I completely agree. For me, events where it makes sense to go, and then we'll see exhibiting or visiting. But the events where it makes sense to go is the events that are actually around this 100 exhibitor mark. Reason being is that at least when I go to an event, I go to close contracts, but at the same time, I'm not so naive to think that I'll be closing a contract on the spot. Though I'm also very conscious of the fact that we are very good at outreach. So we have a 50% conversion rate from when we bring a customer to a first meeting with us to when they sign a contract. So it does matter a lot that we can build that rapport to ensure that we can actually get to the first meeting. But going to the first meeting means that we need to understand what their problem is. In my mind, I have a super easy metric to know if an event is interesting for me or not. And that is if I have enough time to visit the same booth more than 2 times. If I can actually stop at a booth and have the person that I spoke to yesterday remember me and I remember him or her, the idea is really to be sure that, again, I want to know that I'm meeting a human being, not just a source of information that I will never see again or never care of meeting again.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And in the end, sales or building a partnership is about the human connection. And with Dursun, we also had a couple situations where, for example, we were at a smaller event, we were eating lunch, and then we just randomly started chatting to someone at a nearby table, which then turned into a more serious conversation about working together. So those kinds of events, I think, are the most interesting, where you can go to the same people and the people at the booth are decision makers, which is usually the smaller events. But we also found that these bigger industry events that have multiple halls could also have decision makers that are really interested in making new decisions or expanding or just having more conversations about these sorts of partnerships. So I think in the end, it's about having a mix of these bigger events and these smaller events. But we do know that we get more leads from the smaller events, like 100 participants around, 100 exhibitors.
Yeah. And it's also a
Yes.
matter, there is another layer that we need to consider. When going to an event, we have a number of planned meetings that we're going to be going to anyway in most circumstances. And this is more typical on larger events because indeed, as Dursun was saying, mostly a booth is crewed by sales teams. And so if you want to actually speak to a decision maker for us to sell something to that company, we need to pre-schedule an event typically or a meeting. While at smaller events, you can go a bit more on this like impromptu style in which you find someone and there is even the possibility that one of those may be the decision makers. So, yeah. And so why do we exhibit versus why do we visit? How do you interpret our decision-making process?
When we decide what to exhibit, a lot of these events, we already have information from the previous years. Whether it's that we went as attendees, for example, I'm going to give Smile. We went to almost all of their events in 2024 and the beginning of 2025. We know that the exhibitors that are there, the attendees that are there, are really in our customer group profile. So we've seen so much success, why not exhibit? We have this anticipation that it will work out really well for us. So if we have the kind of background information, it helps us make that decision. And if the industry event is very specific, since we do internet, anything IoT, we know that is interesting and relevant for us. So that's where, for example, ITS Brussels comes in, where we also know it's very specific that attendees work in this field where we know that we can add value to what they're creating. So in that way, exhibiting makes sense because we know that the majority of people work at companies that would benefit from perfect internet on the move.
Yeah, and we also have, let's say, perhaps some cost metrics that we have to consider without going into the details of the budget. We want to be sure that when we go as exhibitors to an event, we are capable of returning an amount of, let's say, monetized contracts within the 3 months that follow that event. That needs to be at least 20 times how much we spent for that event. So this is something that we've been capable of doing until now every time we're exhibiting. At the same time, we're also seeing that when we go as visitors, we get very close to that mark anyway, even if we're not there as exhibitors. Maybe I would say if we don't exhibit, we do miss one thing, which is potentially going to become very important in the future, which is the inbounds. When we exhibit, there is a place where people can find us on the app and they can come to us. And so often companies that we wouldn't have the possibility to talk to, they can come to us and talk to us. This is and has been actually very true for CES, if I remember correctly, in which we had quite a lot of inbounds there, but because the event is huge, but at the same time segmented very clearly on who does what. So we do miss the inbound ability if we don't exhibit. That means that we're always going to be considering exhibiting, though statistically, I don't expect that we're going to deviate much from the current 90% ratio of visiting to exhibiting. So out of 10 events, 1 of them we exhibit and 9 of them we visit. And not to scare you too, this year, Nati, you said we're having 44 events in total. Next year, we're targeting at least 65. So because of that, we also know that we're taking some of the events of the 44 of this year and we're dropping them and never try them again for at least the next 3 years. We're going to give them a shot, perhaps eventually, probably eventually. But out of those 44, let's say 30 events of this year survive, which means that next year we're adding at least another 35 events where we are in test and trial mode, as Dursun was saying. We need to go first and see how the situation is there. And realistically, already for those 35 new events of next year, we're not going to be exhibitors. It makes no sense to pre-commit an exhibiting budget if we don't know if the event is relevant first.
Yeah.
And maybe to add another point in terms of the budget, right? Obviously, the cost of exhibiting is so much higher, not only in terms of financial, but also in terms of time commitment, number of staff we need to dedicate, right? Who would be there for the whole entire duration of the event. And versus if you are attending as a visitor, there's no need to stay for the entirety of 4 or 5 days that the event lasts. And that also gives us the possibility maybe to attend 2 events as visitors versus exhibit at 1. And maybe I actually recall the conversation I had, Simone, with you a while back on the topic of exhibiting and versus not exhibiting. And I remember you mentioned that there's also a danger when you exhibit often at specific events. And then for whatever reason, maybe it's financial, maybe low conversion rate, whatever the reason, you decide not to exhibit maybe at some of the events, or you don't exhibit at all. And then you might actually send a negative signal, right, into the market, where people might think, rather companies might think that, oh, maybe Stellar isn't doing so great. They were exhibiting actively last year, and what happened to them now? So there's also that. How important you think is that perspective also to take it into account?
Massive, and we are too young to have it experienced for ourselves, but this learning comes from, let's say, other companies that we've been meeting over time. And sometimes, every time actually I go to a booth, I always ask, how is this event being for you? Is it worth exhibiting? I always try to collect that information every time I stop at a booth. And more often than not, you actually hear, no, exhibiting here is a waste of time, but we have to do it because we've been doing it for so many years that now if we stop doing it, we send the wrong signal. And so when going to an event becomes going for the sake of going, it's stupid. I'm not into that game. I don't think it makes any sense that we do that. I understand that for companies that have had a history with a specific venue, it may not be stupid to do it because of branding preservation or reputation preservation. But on our side, just let's not fall into that trap. So forcing an attendance to an event just for the sake of saying, oh, we've been there last year, let's go again. We've been there for 2 years, let's go again. I don't care. Does it convert? We attend. Does it convert very well? We exhibit. Does it not convert? We ditch it and we never go again.
I think it's a bit of a more complicated question because, like you said, the brand preservation. So in some cases, we go to events. In most cases, right now, we go to events to close deals and make sales. But at some point, I think when Stellar keeps on growing, we're gonna have more of an audience. I think at some point, brand preservation and branding in itself will also become really important part of the events where maybe closing deals will not be the most important aspect of certain events that we attend. And that's going to come with time. And when we get there, we decide what makes sense and when we should just let go of certain events because we don't get a benefit out of it and not get attached like certain companies do to certain events when they keep attending.
And we'll also probably need to evolve on that conversation based on the fact that if you go to, let's say, decades old established companies, they will go to events and again, same trap, they need to be there, otherwise they send a wrong signal. Again, not relevant for us at the moment. But at the same time, when you ask them, how do you define whether it's worth attending or not? They will still give you only metrics that are related to contracts. So even if you go for brand preservation, then the KPIs are still contract signature. So maybe we should have actually another episode in which we talk about how we've restructured this concept of KPIs to make it make sense so that even if a contract is not signed, we can actually see a measurable value in the end. Everything that we cannot measure is not easy to resell either internally or to press to investors and stuff like that, but it doesn't mean it's eventually worthless, right? So what is worthless if we don't know how to capture it in a KPI that allows us to compare it with similar occasions to know what worked better and what worked worse.
So on the topic of attending more events, can you maybe elaborate a bit more, Simone? What does it enable us to do when we don't exhibit and decide to attend maybe instead more events?
You mean on the topic that you brought up? Yes, I can. No, I think you said something super smart, which is the concept of more events at once when we go as visitors rather than exhibitors. What does it mean? It's not that we can be in two places at the same time, but it means that if we go as visitors, we can take an event that lasts 6 days. We know that we can go with 3 people, carpet bomb it for 2 days, deal with whoever we feel that should be contacted, revisit those people, and then leave the event. Often in an event of 5-6 days, 2 days are completely useless. 1 day is for a specific subset of people that is not on the either business interest, which is typically the subset of people that is useful for the event itself to do branding and reputation for themselves. So I would say going as visitors allows us to go for a 2-day incursion, 3-day incursion, or anyway, less days than the duration of the event itself, and then potentially move to another event. We are in an industry, and I'm very happy about that, to be honest, in which just in Europe alone, if we wanted to map all of the events, we have more than 200 events that we could be attending, which means that we're never going to be running out of events and therefore hopefully the ability of closing contracts. But we can capture more and more events only if we do more events within the same week. And you've seen this, Dursun. You went to London for a trip and then Birmingham for another. Same identical flight to go, same flight to come back. 3 events over 3 or 4 days. I think it makes more sense. While if we go as exhibitors all the time, I'm always mixing exhibitors and activists. If we go as exhibitors all the time, an event of 5 days, we are professional enough to crew the booth for 5 days. There are a lot of companies that just go disappear and put a flyer and then leave. We're there for 5 days. We're there for 5 days. So yeah. So what do you think?
Indeed, yeah. Being the one who attended some of these like events back to back, it can be a bit tiring, but also it's also a great idea to, yeah, pick and choose, right? Because it's like trying to hit moving target in a way, because some of these events, as we were saying, it's a trial and error. So we are really trying to figure out if this event is relevant. And I think when going as SND just for a day or two, you don't invest so much of your time and money to stay for 4 days if the event ends up not being relevant. So, for example, in my recent trip to the UK, because there were two events, at least one of them was relevant. And so it was, in my mind, was worth the trip and the effort.
And the thing there soon maybe is that if it had been, if like the first one, was it the second that was relevant to you, right? More than the first?
The first was relevant.
The first one, okay. Because to me, that happened at the beginning of this year, in which I went to an event and then I had to move to another event. The first event was relevant and I had planned 2 days there. And the second event was completely irrelevant. And that was also planned for 2 days. What instead I did was to get back rapidly to the first event, spend an extra day at the first event, and then fly back 1 day earlier. So these are only things that you can do when you go as visitors. As attendees, sorry, as exhibitors, it's much more complex.
Can you repeat that sentence? I feel like I got lost between the exhibitors and the...
Yeah, this is very possible when we go as visitors, therefore attendees. Much more difficult when we do it as exhibitors.
Yes, very true. I don't know if we want to mention some events that we regret attending, because I think the end of 2024 was a big learning for us, where we were attending a lot of events because either we were winning startup prizes or some innovation prizes, and then we had to crew a booth in the startup area of the event. We had an event, we were super excited about it, and we went because we were able to just be there for free because of this award. And after 2 days, we realized that our audience wasn't really at this event and we were wasting the time of our team, which could be spending time on something more productive. And we actually did leave the event early, even though we were exhibiting. Basically, sometimes there's events that we did attend, which didn't really make sense for us to stay. And we did make the difficult decision to leave our booth alone without anyone crewing it, because it was just going to waste more time than leaving our sign up there without anyone there, which only happened one time at this until now.
Yeah, and hopefully it will only happen one time, because it means that we're wasting time at random events if it happens again. But for that specific event that you're mentioning, it was in France. I don't think it was even a too difficult decision that we took, because actually we had realized that the audience was not so relevant. You said very politely, like after 2 days, but in reality, we realized it after 6 hours. And then what happened is that before we decided to stay for 2 days and then leave it, and instead of staying 4 days, what had happened is that half of the booths around us had become vacant, empty, deserted, right? So to a certain extent, it felt like we stayed, instead of staying 2 days shorter than needed, we were there 1 day longer than necessary, because we were the only one at a certain point remaining within a very long line of booths. And it felt so much of a waste of time. Again, happy to go there next year as visitors. 6 hours. That's it.
Yes, and I think another issue that was evident in this event was that the startup area was hidden behind other booths. It wasn't inviting for anyone to go speak to people at this booth, which I think is often the case with startup areas, which is why we're trying not to be exhibiting there. That is one reason, but another reason, we want to be selling more. We're at the stage where we're expanding our sales, so we also don't want to be part of the startup area when we've been growing a lot lately. What are your thoughts?
I guess I would have no difficulty, let's say, in being in the startup area if it made commercial sense. Again, branding is secondary to sales right now. The challenge there is that, as you said, like the startup area, or anyway, like the younger companies area, either you go there and you do a proper 30K investment in a booth, which for us, until we see that we've exhibited that at a certain event for long enough, and then we always and consistently bring in contracts. It's not a decision that we're going to be making to spend 30K at an event just for the booth. The challenge with this, let's say, younger companies' possibilities and opportunities to exhibit, including the startup areas, is that because it is a low yield real estate for the organizers of the events, those booths are either taken at the very entrance of the venue or at the very exit of the venue. And if they're taken, and if they're located in the center, I take the example of the NWC in Barcelona, right? The NWC in Barcelona, the startup area is actually done really well because in addition of having just a startup area, they've created a sub-event, the 4 years from now event. So there is 2 very large halls where young companies go there to exhibit. We were fortunate enough to go as part of a pavilion of one of our customer companies, so we didn't need to do that. But again, very relevant for if you're a startup to exhibit at an event like that, where the startups are being seen as not just collateral damage in an event, but actually the core of a specific section of the venue. While in many other events, and I take it like for example, the startup area is a very small area that ends up being extremely expensive anyway, because the event has a very high prestige. And the result is that you're in an area where no one is stopping, right? So we've seen those companies exhibiting there, and 2 times we've been to these events, and we're like, yeah, it doesn't make sense for us to exhibit there.
And what about if we were to exhibit, I use we as an example, we were to exhibit as part of a pavilion versus, because given that we are a young company, a growing company, they put us kind of in the startup area, right? Because also we don't want to invest the budget, 30K, if we don't know if we're going to reap some benefits out of it. Are there any difference between kind of being tucked into the corner and exhibiting in the startup zone versus being part of a pavilion? Like in our case, we have also France and Luxembourg.
For us, we did it at the beginning of the year at CES 2 times, actually. We were with the Business France Nouvelle Aquitaine region pavilion. It was always super relevant, not because the booth is big or anything. It was big, but not because the booth is, not because of the size of the booth, but because of the surrounding support that then the pavilion organizer gives you. So we were having a lot of meetings organized thanks to Nouvelle Aquitaine, thanks to Business France. And so it made a lot of sense, completely makes a lot of sense. If I have to pick whether to go on a startup booth for the sake of going to a startup booth, meaning only reason to do that is not spending a lot of money, but also not having a lot of traction, or being part of a pavilion of a larger organization, whether that is a regional organization or a cluster of multiple companies, partners, and customers, I would always pick those 2 options. It has a bigger gravitas, a bigger gravity pull of on the branding side, the press, but more importantly for us at this level, customers that come in for inbound. If you exhibit to get inbounds, exhibiting around a black hole gives you more inbounds.
Indeed, and you get a lot more foot traffic as well, right? Because these pavilions, because of the size and everything else, they're located in a better spot. And I know even from my own experience of attending events where I was speaking maybe to one company that was part of the pavilion, and they were like, oh, you should talk to our partner company who are actually, they do have connectivity needs, even if we don't. So there is also this ripple effect where companies that are exhibiting alongside, even if they're not maybe your partners, maybe they are your partners, they can also refer some attendees towards you if they find it relevant.
I think a startup area at an industry event sometimes is an afterthought. Like, we have this industry event about this topic. We need to put the startup somewhere. Let's put them somewhere where it makes sense that they pay less for those number of meters. So usually there's less foot traffic. It's not as exciting. I think some events do the startup area really well. Like, I'm gonna mention SMAU and 4 years from now, where they're really focused on startups. And those events are amazing. I would totally be on the startup booth there because around this topic. But then if we can choose a startup area versus a pavilion, exactly what you said. It's the Région Nouvelle-Aquitaine, for example, has been amazing. We've been at a couple events with them, and it's not only that there's the whole pavilion behind us, the whole group behind us, but also that they are active in bringing press, potential customers, potential partners. And there's always such a nice feeling in these pavilions where, yeah, the people next door will say, oh, what kind of customers are you looking for? If I speak to someone like that, I will send them over. So at CES, we had that with some of the other startups that were, some of the startups that were nearby. And it was great. So I think it's more of a community feeling, which adds a lot of support, which is a lot more helpful in different ways than being at a startup booth. So
let's
it's
give
great.
advice to those who are organizing these events. Which events did we find where the startup area, or at least the smaller company area, younger company areas? Because it's weird actually. Sometimes in the startup booth you find massive companies that are just
Yeah,
exhibiting in a
it's
smaller
true.
space. Which events would we recommend that they should be considering that startup area, let's call it, a bit with a bit less
ATS
of an
Belgium,
afterthought and more focus? So IDS Belgium, you would say, okay, meaning you
100%,
would
yeah.
recommend IDS Belgium to give more prevalence and predominance to the companies
Oh,
because they're all equivalent. That's what I mean. So which
I,
companies would you recommend? Which event organizers would we recommend to give a better thought to where they place the startup locations?
got you. I got the question the other way around, where I
Oh,
would
so you like the
recommend
IDS
companies to
Belgium, how it
go.
is? Yeah, yeah,
Loved
fair
it.
enough. Yeah.
There's so
I
many
don't
in
remember the
this.
name of that event actually. If I can start to give you the example, is the
The
one that we had in Strasbourg, Nati. It was you and I.
Como
Uh,
European Mobility Expo.
the European Mobility Expo. It makes no sense where the startup area is placed. Organizers of the European Mobility Expo, it makes no sense that the startup area is on the left where the rest of the event is on the right. So move it
Yeah,
somewhere else and make it make sense.
because everyone enters and looks towards the big companies, the place where things are
Well,
happening, the
the
big
entrance, at
buses,
least. The door is
literally,
there.
boom. And then the startups are on the left side. Yeah,
Yeah.
Hmm.
agree.
And actually, at a lot of events, or like in most events, they separate it like that. So would it be then, would the idea be to incorporate startups? Maybe you have, I don't know, two bigger size companies and then boom, you have a startup in between, kind of,
It's a
right? So you
super
spread,
beautiful idea to scatter them around.
yeah,
You have large pavilion and small pavilions, so
Yeah.
mixed.
But that's like
you're
IA
forced.
Mobility, where they had the startup booths in the specific halls for that topic, which I think made a lot of sense. For IA Transportation, that was last
Oh yeah,
year,
mobility.
it was
Yes, you're
all
right.
together.
Yeah, you're right. The IA mobility does the startup part better than the IA transportation, which is weird.
Funny. They should
Yeah,
talk sometimes.
they should talk. And
Anything in terms of our trips to events, actually? Because this is another fun thing I like. I'll be honest. I do a lot more events on my own than us traveling together. But my favorite part is actually when we get to travel to these events together, because the way we get there also is interesting. Do you guys have any? I see Nati's. Okay, you're already thinking of some stories, I think. Do you have favorite parts about going to events? Mine, as I said, going as a team, and I'll give you one specific example. If any of our listeners have seen us at events, we are known for our blue jean jacket with Stellar on the back, on the front. So it was so funny when we were going together, at least Nati and I had so many instances when I like lost Nati and the connection doesn't working because it's inside. And then I'm just like walking around and looking for Nati, and then some random person from a random booth says, "Oh, are you looking for your colleague who is wearing the same jean jacket? She just passed this way." So this was like, yeah, my, I think, funny takeaway from events when we go together, and we
Yeah.
are very noticeable because of our jackets.
Even when I'm not looking for Dursun, people are telling me, oh, your colleague went that way. So I always have an eye somewhere in the crowd on my colleagues at events.
better events where we go by train, by car, by plane, or by. That's it. I think those are the three ways that we use
By
to go to
walk, by
events.
bus. If it's in
I don't think we
Luxembourg, we
walk.
go we
Indeed.
go by bus in
Fair
Luxembourg.
enough.
Yeah.
We're all based in Luxembourg, yes, yeah.
That's a good context.
But driving is also fun. besides the waking up early and
You
coming
mean
late
the fact that I
home.
drive is also fun, because then
Yeah. I didn't want to say anything, but yeah, waking up at 4 a.m. is not my favorite, but at least I can take a nap in the car and I'm not driving. So I appreciate that when we can go all together to events and Simone is driving us.
I would say the worst
Indeed.
thing of going to events is actually when Nati gets coffee and spills it in the car. The rest, smooth. Even waking up at
I
4
don't know
a.m.,
what Simone is
uh,
talking about,
not an
so
issue. But multiple
Yeah.
times, by the way, not just once.
it's a
But
curse
apart
by
from
now.
that, yeah, it's cool. You're right. The trip together is probably the best thing. What is super cool for me to see the different themes and topics of what we talk about when we go versus when we come back from an event.
Mm.
Like the
True.
logic is
Really?
completely different.
Yeah.
There is a bit more, of course, debriefing when we go away from an event, but at the same time, the seriousness of the topics change.
How would you say that they changed? Less serious on the way back or more serious?
More serious on the way back, more chatty to go, and more serious on the way back. Still chatty and still coffee being spilled, but more serious on the tones.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we do sometimes also try to be productive during these long drives. Thankfully, we have Global, our own hardware solution. We plug it in and we're able to have sometimes team calls and customer calls, which also, yeah, makes it maybe a bit more serious at times. Get some work done during
And
Yeah, and to your point earlier, Tristan, you were saying, oh, our connectivity doesn't work inside. I have a cheat code for that because I have one of our cards inside my
yeah,
smartphone.
we
No,
But
should
for me, it
share with the
works
rest
inside.
of the team.
No,
indeed,
it's
indeed.
fine. I
Yeah.
find you with the jackets for now.
So we've discussed so many aspects of industry events. Shall we do a quick rundown of our key takeaways from today's conversation? I can
You
start
start.
myself. Yeah, perfect. So for me, I think the biggest takeaway, industry events are trial and error. It requires a lot of your time, investment, resources to figure out what events really matter, and then for you to focus on those events.
Think my takeaway for today is that when we have the opportunity to exhibit at a large industry event that is relevant to us, it would always be more helpful to exhibit on a pavilion that we know will support us through the process and bring us more leads rather than a startup area, which is sometimes not in the best area of the event. What about you, Simone?
I would say, or I would add, my takeaway being the fact that if you can choose between an event where there are 1,000 exhibitors versus an event where there are 50 or 100 exhibitors, pick the smaller event.
I think that's a wrap, guys. Anything else to add?
We're good. We're good. It was great. It's
Perfect.
great to have this interaction. Spoiler alert for the audience: this is one of the first episodes that we are recording, and we're gonna be smoothening out the flow as we learn together with you. And it was great to have your attention, and hopefully we speak soon.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye bye.